On July 11th, George R. R. Martin made a long post on his blog providing several tidbits about dragon lore and mentioned that the origin of dragons will be revealed in the upcoming novels. My dragons do not talk. They are relatively intelligent, but they are still beasts. They bond with men, some men, and the why and how of that, and how it came to be, will eventually be revealed in more detail in The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, and some in Fire and Blood. Septim Barth got much of it right. If you've been following my channel, you'll remember that back in 2019, I released 2 videos exploring the origin of dragons, and I've had part 3 on my mind since that time. And with Martin's new blog post, I feel almost compelled to finish what I started. So, without further ado, this will be the 3rd installment in the original series of videos dedicated to explaining the origin of dragons within the world Martin has created. And in doing so, we will be diving even deeper into dragon lore and discover the true nature of the Valyrian race before they became dragon lords, and how their magical bond came to be. And so, to recap, in Part 1, we uncovered evidence to suggest sorcery and a mixing of wyvern and fireworm being the case for dragon creation. And with the Valyrian claims of possessing the blood of the dragon, when examining Targaryen stillbirths, the possession of both wyvern and fireworm genetics justifies the many twisted deformities that have occurred, such as wings, scales, eyeless, blind, or limbless features. However, there was one confounding issue: the evidence to suggest dragons existed prior to the founding of the Valyrian freehold. Architectural evidence of fused stone structures in both Westeros and the Five Forts suggests the great empire of the Dawn both possessed and controlled dragons, in addition to several ancient histories and legends supporting this origin as well. However, after understanding the Valyrian civilization is a descendant of the more ancient civilization of the Great Empire, this would mean dragons were not created by the Valyrians, but rather by their ancestral civilization, the Great Empire of the Dawn. This makes the claims that an ancient people first tamed dragons in the shadow and taught the Valyrians their arts start to make sense, because the Great Empire was merely the precursor to the Valyrian civilization. Additionally, in Part 2, we examined the presence of the Great Empire around the area of both the Five Forts and the ruined city of Yin in Sithorios, as well as the half-human or hybrid races found near both locations, which exhibit characteristics that align with the scaled, winged, and eyeless deformities found in Targaryen stillbirths. This suggests that what we are seeing with these races of men are failed attempts or prototypes of what would eventually become the Valyrian race. Because if dragons are the product of blood magic, and Valyrians share the blood of the dragon, that would mean that the Valyrians are the product of blood magic as well. Or, said another way, the product of a desired outcome. And this corroborates Septim Barth's statements, claiming that the Valyrians twisted the flesh of beasts and men to fashion monstrous and unnatural chimeras, as well as the rumors of the flesh pits of Gogassos, where blood sorcery was rumored to have mated beasts with men. On its southern coasts stand the broken ruins of a city, founded by the Empire of Old Geese. It was known as Gorgai for close on 2 centuries, or perhaps 4, there is some dispute, until the Dragon Lords of Valyria captured it during the Third Giscari War and renamed it Gogassos. By any name, it was an evil place. The Dragon Lords sent their worst criminals to the Isle of Tears to live out their lives in hard labor. In the dungeons of Gogassos, torturers devised new torments. In the flesh pits, blood sorcery of the darkest sort was practiced, as beasts were mated to slave women to bring forth twisted, half-human children. And after examining the death of Princess Rhaeva Targaryen, and how her body was astonishingly able to acclimate to creatures of heat and fire in ways that the average person cannot, it was identified that humans were likely also used for dragon creation. While Martin has stated that Targaryens are not immune to fire, he has gone on record stating that they do possess the ability to tolerate more heat than the ordinary person. But it wasn't until the publication of Fire and Blood that we learned exactly how much heat resistance their bodies might actually possess. According to Septim Barth's accounts, When infested with these parasites, Area's skin felt as hot as if he were thrusting his hand into a pot of boiling oil. And while this comparison seems like an exaggeration, Area's extreme internal temperature became so hot that her eyes burst, and she had smoke issuing from every orifice, and her pain was so great that she begged for death. So, by examining how these worms had set up residence inside Rhaea, and how her body acclimated to these conditions, it is safe to say that her body was able to tolerate the extreme conditions that allowed these parasites to thrive, making Rhaea's body the perfect host. And after understanding that the Valyrian race is the product of blood magic, and recognizing the profound heat tolerance their blood provides, it seems quite possible that humans with these traits once served as vehicles or hosts for the blood magic involved in dragon creation, as the worms that burst out of Rhaea also appear to be hybrids themselves, and had taken on unnatural human features, such as hands and faces. But in order to fully understand what is going on, we need to explore this concept of genetic engineering further, because dragons are probably not the only creatures to result from this type of magic. If you recall, Septon Barth recounted that the Dragon Lords practiced blood magic and other dark arts to twist the flesh of beasts and men in order to fashion monstrous and unnatural chimeras. And in our own world, a chimera is a mythical fire-breathing beast from Greek lore that was composed of different animal parts. However, in time, the term chimera has come to describe any mythical creature with parts taken from various animals. And in A Song of Ice and Fire, in the regions of Sithorios and the Great Empire, there are more examples of chimeras to be found, particularly the manticore and the basilisk. In our own world, the manticore was a creature from Persian mythology, similar to the Egyptian Sphinx, which, instead of having the head of a human and the body of a lion, the manticore had the head of a human, the body of a lion, and the tail of a scorpion. However, in A Song of Ice and Fire, the manticore is much different, and described as appearing like a scarab, but when it's ready to strike, it unfolds itself and begins hissing like a cobra, while revealing a human-like face and a scorpion's tail. In Davos 5 of A Storm of Swords, it is revealed that manticores are depicted on the battlements of Dragonstone, along with a slew of other chimeras. He raised his eyes to gaze up at the walls. In the place of Merlons, 1,000 grotesques and gargoyles looked down on him, each different from all the others. Wyverns, griffins, demons, manticores, minotaurs, basilisks, hellhounds, cockatrices, and 1,000 queer creatures sprouted from the castle's battlements as if they'd grown there, and the dragons were everywhere. So, fun fact, architecturally speaking, the terms gargoyle, grotesque, and chimera are closely related and are often used interchangeably. So because a chimera can refer to both a creature with mixed parts taken from various animals, and also the architectural statues, often referred to as gargoyles, if the Valyrians or their ancestors were creating unnatural chimeras by giving them a building style with these gargoyles that feature dragons, along with various other hybrid creatures such as minotaurs, cockatrices, basilisks, manticores, and griffins, well, this may be a hint that their experimentation went beyond the creation of just dragons. In Tyrion 7 of A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion sees the fused black stone long bridge of Volantis that is described as having statues of sphinxes, manticores, dragons, and creatures stranger still. And as you are probably already aware, the Valyrian sphinxes with the body of a dragon and the face of a human are a hint to the blood of the dragon and the blood ties Valyrians share. So Tyrion sees statues of sphinxes, manticores, dragons, and even stranger creatures. And while basilisks do not have a clear description in the series, we do know they are venomous, and in A Dance with Dragons, Daenerys mentions that they are hideous to look upon. And in our own world, basilisks were mythical venomous chimeras resembling something possessing the parts of a weasel, a rooster, and a snake. And in A Song of Ice and Fire, Basilisks can be found in the Basilisk Isles, Sothoryos, and the jungles of ET. The Basilisk Isles were interestingly named after this creature that once infested them, and the Basilisk Isles in particular are also where the flesh pits of Gogossos were rumored to have been located. We basically have a confirmed site where blood magic experimentation took place, and the island chain is named after them. And if they are anything similar to the mythological basilisk in our own world, then they are a type of chimera, which are notably depicted among the gargoyles on Dragonstone. And while we do know that dragons were magically created and are inherently linked to magic, in Daenerys 3 of A Game of Thrones, when Daenerys is discussing whether magic and dragons still exist, basilisks and manticores are interestingly mentioned as though they too are tied to magic in some way. Magic had died in the West when the doom fell on Valyria and the lands of the Long Summer, and neither spell-forged steel, nor storm-singers, nor dragons could hold it back. But Dany had always heard that the East was different. It was said that manticores prowled the islands of the Jade Sea, that basilisks infested the jungles of ET, that spell-singers, warlocks, and aeromancers practiced their arts openly in Ashai, while shadowbinders and blood mages worked terrible sorceries in the black of night. Why shouldn't there be dragons too? And the manticore and basilisk, these are only two examples. In reality, with all the experimentation that could have taken place during the reign of the Great Empire, there were likely more of these magically engineered chimeras created, which is symbolically alluded to when the author mentions 1,000 queer creatures sprouting from Dragonstone's battlements as if they'd grown there. But in the meantime, keeping in mind the various prototypes, failed attempts, and hybrid races of men that can be found in both Sothoryos and the Great Empire, we really need to take a closer look at the relationship between the once great empire of the Dawn and that of the earliest people that began the line of the Valyrian race. What is interesting here is that the Great Empire, a civilization with advanced architecture, technology, magic, and dragons, fell. Not only did it fall, but despite several other civilizations, such as Yi-Ti, Lang, and the Jogosnai, and various other peoples descending from the Great Empire, the Valyrians were interestingly the only people to have retained dragons and dragon riding within their newfound society. In fact, in addition to dragons and dragon bond, the Valyrians do not share any noticeable physical characteristics with any other peoples of the East, even those descended from the Great Empire. And if the Proto-Valyrian Dragon Lords were the ruling class, an even more intriguing question arises, because if the Valyrian race is the product of blood magic, judging by the various animal-human hybrid races found in both Sothoryos and beyond the Five Forts, there was a large amount of experimentation going on before the Valyrian race was created. And if this process involved anything similar to what had befallen Rhaea, why would they continue this torture on themselves after so many failed attempts? And who would consent to it? Certainly the ruling class wouldn't be sending their family members off to be used as subjects for a process that could result in insurmountable pain and the creation of half-human monstrosities. That's probably not something you would do to someone you loved. That's not even something you would do to your neighbor. Simply put, if the Great Empire was doing human experimentation, they probably didn't use their own people. And if we look at our own real-world history, when unethical human experimentation did happen, it was often carried out on marginalized populations, which is exactly what we see with the rumors of Gogossos, that they mated animals to slave women. And the one bit of knowledge we do know about the Valyrian race before they controlled dragons is that they were a society of shepherds. And if Martin is trying to give us a hint, we do have one shepherding society in the book series, the Lazarene. And when they are introduced into the series, the first thing that happens to them is enslavement. And when we look at the tale of the fall of the Great Empire, there are hints of an uprising taking place. For 10,000 years, the Great Empire of the Dawn flourished in peace and plenty under the God on earth, until at last he ascended to the stars to join his forebears. Dominion over mankind then passed to his eldest son, who was known as the Pearl Emperor, and ruled for 1,000 years. the Jade Emperor, the Tourmaline Emperor, the Onyx Emperor, the Topaz Emperor, and the Opal Emperor followed in turn, each reigning for centuries, yet every reign was shorter and more troubled than the one preceding it, for wild men and baleful beasts pressed at the border of the great empire. Lesser kings grew prideful and rebellious, and the common people gave themselves over to avarice, envy, lust, murder, incest, gluttony, and sloth. So we see mention of wild men and baleful beasts pressing on the border of the great empire. And if the map is any clue, it appears their greatest threat was whatever lay beyond their eastern border due to the presence of the fortification walls of the 5 forts. And if you notice, beyond the 5 forts is where we find some of the hybrid races of their own creation, such as the lizard men, winged men, and bloodless men. And in Sothorios, we see a parallel, where many of the settlements and settlers were destroyed, devoured, or driven out by the brindled men, who also appear to be hybrid men of some sort. And when we return to the fall of the great empire, we see mention of lesser kings growing prideful and rebelling, but the most telling thing we see is the mention of the common people giving themselves over to George R.R. Martin's version of the 7 deadly sins. It's the incest that was injected here that I want to draw your attention to. If incest was considered sinful by the great empire, well, it seems counterintuitive because incest is something the Dragon Lords were known for and was practiced in order to prevent the dilution of their special blood ties to their dragons. And in the tale of the great empire's fall, it was the common people who gave themselves over to incest. So, if the Valyrians having this special bond with dragons was an unintended consequence of these experiments, what exactly was the intention? Why were humans used? Well, the intention was likely to create dragons that were capable of being trained and ridden by humans. If you recall, dragons were created by combining 2 creatures, the fireworm and the wyvern. And the blood mages probably could have mixed just those 2 creatures to create a dragon, but they likely ran into a problem. So here's a question. Have you ever heard of a wyvern rider in Martin's world? Wyverns are found all over Sothorios, and are the next best thing to a dragon. They don't grow as large, and they don't breathe fire, but they have teeth and talons, and can grow as large as a school bus, and most importantly, they fly. And after the doom and the death of dragons in Valyrian society, riding a wyvern would have been the next best thing. And if a wyvern could be tamed and ridden by humans, someone would have done so. The reason why we don't hear about anyone riding a wyvern is because they can't be ridden. In case you hadn't noticed, the World Book describes wyverns as being the most terrible creatures in Sothorios. Farther south lie the regions known as the Green Hell, where beasts even more fearsome are said to dwell. There, if the tales are to be trusted, are caverns full of pale white vampire bats who can drain the blood from a man in minutes. Tattooed lizards stalk the jungles, running down their prey and ripping them apart with long curved claws on their powerful hind legs. Snakes, 50 feet long, slither through the underbrush, and spotted spiders weave their webs amongst the great trees. Most terrible of all are the wyverns, those tyrants of the southern skies, with their great leathery wings, cruel beaks, and insatiable hunger. Close kin to dragons, wyverns cannot breathe fire, but they exceed their cousins in ferocity and are a match for them in all respects, save size. So wyverns are more ferocious than dragons and more terrible than the tattooed lizards, which are likely Martin's version of velociraptors. The chances of taming such a beast are probably non-existent. And just as wyverns cannot be tamed, the same goes for fireworms. If somebody could ride a fireworm, someone would have done so, and there would be fireworm riders, and we probably would have heard about it. But the kindly man tells us that fireworms have no love for men, which hints to their ferocity. And in part 1, we discussed the hatching of Laena Valerian's dragon egg that produced a dragon hatchling whose worm genetics had presented more overtly than the other sums of its parts. And in this account, we are able to see firsthand the innate temperament of the creature. The first omen of the dark times to come was seen on Driftmark. when the dragon's egg presented to Laena Velaryon upon her birth quickened and hatched. Her parents' pride and pleasure quickly turned to ash, however. The dragon that wriggled from the egg was a monstrosity, a wingless worm, maggot-white and blind. Within moments of hatching, the creature turned upon the babe in her cradle and tore a bloody chunk from her arm. As Laena shrieked, Lord Oakenfist ripped the dragon off her, flung it to the floor, and hacked it to pieces. So, by combining only the fireworm and the wyvern, you would get a dragon, no doubt. The only drawback is, and this is the problem the Great Empire likely ran into, is that you would have absolutely no way to tame it. Essentially, you would get the equivalent of the cannibal, a fierce dragon that could not be ridden or bonded to. But just like in Damon's dragon taming song, the dragon has 3 heads, or said another way, 3 components, the third being human. And this is where the third head comes into play. One thing that has been mentioned several times in the Slavers Bay chapters is that people from peaceful societies such as the Lazarene, the Summer Islanders, and the Nathi make the best slaves and are described as more docile and obedient. And if the Valyrians were originally shepherds, it's worth noting that shepherds and shepherding societies in popular culture are often depicted as peaceful. And just as the dragon blood is said to make Targaryens more hot-tempered and prone to madness, the injection of human qualities was likely intended to temper the dragon, to make it more docile and obedient, which would result in a monstrous, flying, fire-breathing creature with higher intelligence that could potentially be trained and ridden by their masters. The dragon blood, or the bond their slaves developed with their kin, likely allowed them to gain control of the dragons, bringing about the Great Empire's downfall. Now, some of you may already be aware of this, but in case you missed it, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, George R.R. Martin has gone on record stating that the maesters who claim the Long Night occurred 8,000 years ago are wrong, and that the Long Night occurred 5,000 years ago. In addition to the author confirming this, there are plenty of essays and videos that highlight the evidence throughout the book series to support this as well. We also know that the fall of the Great Empire occurred either during or directly following the Long Night, which coincidentally aligns with the emergence of the Valyrian freehold, which is also said to have occurred 5,000 years ago. While there is no historical record of the Valyrians having any conflict with the Great Empire, this timeline interestingly matches the Valyrians warring with an ancient society of slavers who had known settlements in Xithorios, as well as the nearby Basilisk Isles, including Gorgai, a settlement that would later become Gogassos, where the flesh pits are rumored to be found. That ancient society of slavers was Old Gis. In addition to having a presence in Xithorios, we also know that Old Gis was thriving during the same period in history as the Great Empire. As Tyrion puts it in A Dance with Dragons, Giscari's slave cities were old when the world was young. And in A Storm of Swords, Krasnismo Naklas tells us that Gis ruled an empire when the Valyrians were still fucking sheep. And in the same book, Grasden Mo Eras tells us that Gis was old when Valyria was yet a squalling child. So, like the Great Empire, Old Gis was established and thriving before the Long Night. And like the Great Empire, Old Gis had settlements in Xithorios. And if you look at a map, Old Gis held the settlement at the mouth of the Zamoyos River, and because of its strategic location, they likely controlled whatever went into or came out of that river, which means they controlled the likeliest route both into and out of Yin. And if this is the case, then what we are looking at with Old Gis is potentially what began as a colony or a tributary of the Great Empire that performed oversight of the slave trade and their dealings in Xithorios. And while this may seem like speculation, we do have the evidence to back this up. And this is where it gets interesting. There are textual clues to suggest the Giscari had a hand in performing the blood magic used in dragon creation. As you may already be aware, George R.R. Martin drew heavy inspiration from ancient northern Africa for Old Gis, particularly with the parallels drawn between the Punic Wars between Carthage and Rome and the Giscari Wars between Old Gis and Valyria. But as far as the culture of Gis, Martin draws inspiration more heavily from Carthage's neighbor to the east, ancient Egypt. From pyramids and deserts to obelisks and tombs, to the use of glyphic symbols for writing, to even the extensive use of slavery. They have cobras and jackals and locusts, and if the manticore was their creation, well then they also have scarabs. And just as we have been discussing Old Gis's settlement on the Zimoyos River, if you look at a map, you will notice that the Nile River was used for its template. When it comes to Egyptian-inspired culture, Old Gis seems to have it all, except for one thing that is almost as iconic as the pyramids: the Sphinx, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be found in Valyrian culture, and is a symbol that represents the magical blood ties they share. But the Sphinx is more than just that. In Martin's world, a Sphinx can take on various appearances because it is simply an amalgamation of more than one creature with the face of a human. In the EXPERIMENTATION's prologue, the Sphinx is described by Pate as a mixture of things. A bit of this, a bit of that. A human face, the body of a lion, the wings of a hawk. And in Samuel 5 of the same book, Sam describes the sphinxes of the Citadel as having the bodies of lions, the wings of eagles, and the tails of serpents. It isn't until A Dance with Dragons that we come across one with the face of a woman and the body of a dragon. Now, if a sphinx is truly simply a mixture of different creatures with the face of a human, well, that would mean that a sphinx is simply a chimera with a human face. And if this is the case, then Old Gis does have all the iconic aspects of ancient Egypt, including the Sphinx. It simply goes by another name: the Harpy. In our own world, the Harpies were mythical half-human monsters from Greek mythology that possessed the face of a woman and the body of a bird. But in Martin's world, the Giscari Harpy looks much different, and is described in Daenerys II of A Storm of Swords as having some very peculiar features. In the center of the Plaza of Pride stood a red brick fountain whose water smelled of brimstone, and in the center of the fountain a monstrous harpy made of hammered bronze. 20 feet tall she reared. She had a woman's face with gilded hair, ivory eyes, and pointed ivory teeth. Water gushed yellow from her heavy breasts, but in place of arms she had the wings of a bat or a dragon. Her legs were the legs of an eagle, and behind she wore a scorpion's curled and venomous tail. The Harpy of Gis, Danny thought. Old Gis had fallen 5,000 years ago, if she remembered true. Its legion shattered by the might of young Valyria, its brick walls pulled down, its streets and buildings turned to ash and cinder by dragon flame, its very fields sown with salt, sulfur, and skulls. So the Harpy of Gis depicted in the Game of Thrones show was not completely accurate, and looked more like the harpy found in Greek mythology, with the face and torso of a woman and the body of a bird. This artist rendering from Fantasy Flight Games by Juan Barquet is a book-accurate rendering. And if you notice, it does evoke the very image of a sphinx. In fact, the Giscari Harpy is closer to the Valyrian Sphinx seen by Tyrion in A Dance with Dragons than the sphinxes that sit outside the Citadel. Because instead of the wings of a bird, the harpy has the wings of a bat or a dragon, and instead of the body of a lion, the harpy has the legs of an eagle, which is still very evocative of the limbs of what might be found on a wyvern or a dragon, as you can see here, here, and here. In fact, this is the picture of the talons of a flightless bird called a cassowary. Modern birds are, of course, the descendants of the only dinosaur lineage to survive the Cretaceous mass extinction, and possess faint remnants of their prehistoric ancestors. And due to the wyvern's possession of a beak, there's a good chance that the wyvern is even more bird-like than we realize. Now, when we move to the harpy's tail, this is very evocative of the manticore, which is another creature in Martin's world that likely resulted from the same type of blood magic. If manticores were created through blood magic, we are given a clue that humans were also used for their creation, due to their possession of a disturbing human-like face, which parallels Septembar's account of Princess Rhaeva, whose parasites that poured forth were described as snakes with hands and worms with faces. And then when we return to the Far East, to the hybrid races beyond the Five Forts, the race of lizard men called the Shrikes are said to possess poisonous bites. And if there is any truth to these claims, it means that the Great Empire was experimenting with poisonous creatures. And so, if the Sphinx is a symbol of the blood magic used in dragon creation, and the gargoyles and other Valyrian statuary representative of the same type of experimentation, then it's quite possible that the harpy is as well. Because not only does the harpy fit the author's description of a sphinx, but in addition to this, its attributes align with those of both dragons and manticores, creatures that were created through blood magic that likely involved a human component. And the sphinx may simply be a symbol that evolved from the even more ancient symbol of Old Gis. Martin alludes to this symbolically by Dany questioning if she is a dragon or a harpy in A Storm of Swords. And in the same book, when discussing what to do with the statue above the pyramid, the sculptor suggests they sculpt the face to look like Daenerys. But instead, the harpy is removed, and in its place, Drogon begins roosting at the apex where the harpy once stood. And in A Feast for Crows, Cersei hears news of a slave revolt and talk of dragons in Meereen from Qyburn, and Cersei corrects him, assuming that the reports of dragons are simply harpies. The slave revolt in Astapor has spread to Meereen, it would seem. Sailors off a dozen ships speak of dragons. Harpies. It is harpies in Meereen. She remembered that from somewhere. Meereen was at the far end of the world, out east beyond Valyria. And if the Valyrian Sphinx is an evolution from the harpy, because the harpy is representative of Giscari culture and the slavery they practice, this may be a clue as to their role in the slave trade in the distant past. And if their ancient culture did experiment with blood magic to create hybrids, this would explain the hairstyles common among the Giscari, who oil and fashion their hair into wings, horns, and spikes, which make them appear as though they have the features of animals. And another hint is the connection to Asshai. In Part 2, we discuss the likelihood of the Great Empire having at least one settlement in Sithorios in the distant past, due to the similarity in building construction of both Asshai and Yin, which are constructed entirely of the same oily black stone, and both locations have the presence of hybrid races. Asshai, of course, is an incredibly ancient and mysterious city with dragon origin legends surrounding it, while Yin in Sithorios is a similarly ancient and mysterious settlement and was likely in close proximity to wyverns and other animal specimens used in their blood magic. And if we're looking for the civilization responsible for the creation of dragons, we should closely examine the civilization that settled Wyvern Point. And although the origin of Yin is mysterious, the people who settled Wyvern Point are not. And it was Old Gis who settled Wyvern Point. It's probably not a coincidence that Old Gis and the Great Empire were both thriving with a presence in Sithorios during the same period in history. This is because Old Gis was the Great Empire's presence in Sithorios. And just as we see this shared connection to Yin and Asshai in building construction and dragon origins, the Asshai legends claim that dragons first came from the shadow, and the two ancient magical cities that we know of in the shadow are Asshai and Stgai. And with the Giscari cities, we also see similarities in the naming patterns such as Gorzai, Gogai, and Yunkai. And for what it's worth, the ruined city of Yin sounds as though Martin may have simply combined the names of both Yunkai and Meereen to come up with Yin. But whatever the case, out of all of these, the most important city name, the city that ties everything together, is Stgai. Given its mysterious and foreboding nature, it's highly likely that Stgai was also performing corrupted blood magic, perhaps even more so than Asshai. In fact, if we look closely at the text, it's possible that dragon creation took place in Stgai rather than Asshai. Asshai is a port city on the very edge of the Shadowlands, and when people refer to Asshai, they often use the term Asshai by the Shadow. The Shadowlands themselves encompass a vast area with the city of Stgai referred to in the World Book as the Shadow's Heart. and when dragon origin legends are mentioned, the place where they are described as coming from is the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. For example, when Illyrio gives Dany her eggs, he tells her that the eggs came from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. And in the same book, when Dany is discussing dragon origins with her handmaidens, she mentions that she had heard that the first dragons came from the east, from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. And when Septon Barth's suppositions on dragon origins are discussed in the World Book, it simply states the Asshai histories say that a people so ancient they had no name first tamed dragons in the shadow. The location named is simply described as the shadow. And if you notice, Styggai, being an even more foreboding place of dark magic, found further inland than Asshai, and known as the Shadow's Heart, is definitely within the realm of the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. The reason why Asshai is most associated with dragon creation is because when we hear the term the Shadowlands beyond Asshai, or simply the Shadow, our minds go to Asshai and stay there. And this is because this is the city we know the most about, and hear the most about, and have characters in our story such as Marwyn, Melisandre, and Mary Mazdur who have been there. And even though the World Book describes Asshai as a magically toxic place where you might learn strange and dark magics, Styggai is probably just as toxic. But because nobody dares to even go there, it's much more terrifying and mysterious. The only thing that we do know about Styggai is that it is home to hideous and twisted creatures. Most sinister of all the sorcerers of Asshai are the Shadowbinders, whose lacquered masks hide their faces from the eyes of gods and men. They alone dare to go upriver past the walls of Asshai into the heart of darkness. On its way from the mountains of the Morn to the sea, the ash runs howling through a narrow cleft in the mountains, between towering cliffs so steep and close that the river is perpetually in shadow, save for a few moments at midday when the sun is at its zenith. In the caves that pockmark the cliffs, demons and dragons and worse make their lairs. The farther from the city one goes, the more hideous and twisted these creatures become, until at last one stands before the doors of Styggai, the corpse city at the Shadow's Heart, where even the Shadowbinders fear to tread. If you notice, the closer one gets to Styggai, we find tales of dragons and demons and worse making their lairs in the cliffs. And the closer one gets to the Shadow's Heart, the more twisted and hideous the creatures are rumored to become. Like the chimeras in Martin's world, this might be another hint of this type of blood magic taking place. And these tales of such creatures may be more than just rumors, as this is also a match for the statues seen by Dany in Vaes Dothrak. Monsters stood in the grass beside the road, black iron dragons with jewels for eyes, roaring griffins, manticores with their barbed tails poised to strike, and other beasts she could not name. Some of the statues were so lovely they took her breath away, others so misshapen and terrible that Dany could scarcely bear to look at them. Those, Ser Jorah said, had likely come from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai. And the demons and dragons and worse, with misshapen creatures, are also a match for the gargoyles seen on the battlements of Dragonstone, where, among other things, Davos had seen demons and dragons and 1,000 queer creatures. Another Easter egg that you might not be aware of is Martin's inspiration for Styggai. George R. R. Martin has gone on record and mentioned in several places that one of his influences as a fantasy writer was Robert E. Howard. Howard was a fantasy writer in the 1930s who is most famous for writing 21 short stories and one novel surrounding the Thurian and Hyborian ages of a fictional Earth, the most recognizable of his characters being Conan the Barbarian. And one thing that readers have noticed is that Styggai is likely a nod to one of the locations in Howard's novels called Stygia, because in A Song of Ice and Fire, Styggai is connected to dark magic and described as a corpse city in the heart of the shadow, while Howard's Stygia is a land of dark sorcerers and magic with shadow-guarded tombs. But the most interesting thing is that just as we have been discussing the Egyptian influence given to the culture of Old Gis, you might be interested to know that Stygia was Robert E. Howard's version of Egypt, complete with tombs and pyramids, a capital named Luxor, and a serpent god named Set. In fact, because Howard's world was simply a fantasy-inspired prehistory of our modern-day Earth, the Stygian civilization would go on to evolve into the Egyptian civilization. So, a little background information. In Howard's world, the initial conquerors of Stygia were described as mysterious people who, after a cataclysm had sunk the land of Lemuria into the sea, they would go on to enslave the surviving Lemurians. And these Lemurians remained enslaved for centuries before eventually rising up to destroy their Stygian masters. Now, Lemuria is a reference to a hypothetical lost continent that was proposed by zoologists in the 19th century to explain the distribution of lemur fossils found in both Madagascar and India. Despite being scientifically debunked, the lost land of Lemuria can be found incorporated into many fantasy stories in popular culture. Curiously, in A Song of Ice and Fire, there is a lemur that possesses silver fur and purple eyes, found in the forests of Qohor, the Summer Isles, and Sithorios, that is said to resemble Valyrians, who have similar features of silver hair and purple eyes. And because of this, these lemurs are referred to as Little Valyrians. What I do want to draw your attention to is the symbolic significance of having a species of lemur that are referred to as Little Valyrians, and the connection the author is drawing between the two. Because, in case you hadn't noticed, this is another clue. If you recall, Howard's Egyptian-inspired Stygians had enslaved the Lemurians, who would then in turn revolt after centuries of subjugation and throw off the yoke of their masters. And if what I'm suggesting is true, well then this is exactly what happened with Martin's Valyrians, who began as slaves of the Great Empire, but would later overpower their masters and go on to form an empire of their own. And if true, then it seems likely the Little Valyrian lemurs are just another breadcrumb laid out by our author as a hint to the true origin of the Valyrian race. And if that weren't enough, in Howard's book, the word Stygia is borrowed from the term Stygian, which can mean of or relating to the river Styx, the river leading to the underworld in Greek mythology. But because of its connection to the underworld, Stygian can also refer to anything unpleasantly dark, gloomy, or foreboding. And Martin, interestingly, uses the term Stygian only once in his book series, and it is coincidentally to describe the inside of the pyramid in Meereen, when Quentyn is trying to tame a dragon. The chains fell away in a rattling clatter, so loud Quentyn was certain half the pyramid must have heard them. "Bring the cart." The dragons would be more docile once fed. Let them gorge themselves on charred mutton. Archibald Ironwood grasped the iron doors and pulled them apart. Their rusted hinges let out a pair of screams for all those who might have slept through the breaking of the lock. A wash of heat assaulted them, heavy with the odors of ash, brimstone, and burnt meat. It was black beyond the doors, a sullen Stygian darkness that seemed alive and threatening. That's right. The one time the word Stygian is used, it's describing the inside of the pyramid in Meereen, which alludes to the author symbolically tying this to Howard's Egyptian Stygia, and he does so in the Dragon Tamer chapter. So, another fun fact about Robert E. Howard is that he was pen pals with H.P. Lovecraft, and both writers would occasionally borrow concepts from each other's worlds and incorporate those concepts within their own. And Robert E. Howard was one of a handful of writers who wrote within the Cthulhu mythos universe, known as the Lovecraft Circle. And George R. R. Martin has mentioned both Lovecraft and Howard as being influential to him as a writer, with plenty of Lovecraftian nods and Easter eggs to be found throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, the most enigmatic of which being the oily black stone of Ashai and the tale of the Bloodstone Emperor. According to the World Book, the Bloodstone Emperor brought on the long night and cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky, and became the first high priest of the Church of Starry Wisdom. And this is interestingly a reference to H.P. Lovecraft's The Haunter in the Dark, where the cult of Starry Wisdom worshipped a black stone called the Shining Trapezohedron. The shining trapezohedron is a mysterious black stone that serves as a window to both space and time, revealing other worlds and arcane knowledge, and allowing its wielder to summon an outer god, Nyarlathotep. His most recognizable aspect is that of an Egyptian pharaoh, as described in Lovecraft's 1920 prose poem, Nyarlathotep. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The fellahi knelt when they saw him, yet they could not say why. He had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries. In The Hunter of the Dark, Robert Blake also recounts that the shining trapezohedron passed through various ancient civilizations before coming into the hands of the pharaohs of Egypt. The pharaoh Nefer-Ka had become one of his mortal avatars, who had cast down the worship of the gods in Egypt and built a temple for the shining trapezohedron, just as the Bloodstone Emperor had cast down the true gods to worship the black stone that fell from the sky. So, in addition to Stgai, we also see this shared Egyptian commonality within the inspiration for the Bloodstone Emperor. And given everything we have just discussed, I believe it is highly likely that the bond the Valyrians developed with their dragons was an unintended consequence of the Great Empire, who were attempting to engineer a dragon that was less ferocious and more intelligent than the other two sums of its parts, thereby creating a creature who could be tamed and ridden, meaning that if dragons were originally created with that intention, this might open up the possibility that dragons can indeed be tamed. However, as Martin has pointed out, sorcery is a dangerous thing, likening it to a sword without a hilt, with no safe way to grasp, and powers being evoked that should not be toyed with, and outcomes being variable and potentially disastrous.
That's also true of dragons and blood magic and everything kind of magical and sorcerous goes on in my world. It's not easy. You're evoking things that maybe you shouldn't mess with.
The great empire's hunger for power and their disregard for the natural order of both man and beast would eventually lead to its downfall and destruction. And it is my belief that Daenerys freeing the slaves of Slaver's Bay is meant as an allegory to this, which, if you think about it, makes one of the most powerful lines in the books even more profound. Well, that about wraps things up for today. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor and leave a comment and hit that like button. It really does help.